Thanks for coming back. Um, just, acknowledging you had the agency to leave, but you chose to come back, which is really nice. And thank you, everybody who's logged back on to the Zoom for joining us for the second half of our conversation today. So our next panel is on revolution and counter-revolution, moderated by Khulud Khair. So Khulud, I'll let you take it away. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bayan, and welcome back, everyone. I think in many ways this panel is going to take us back a bit, because I think hearing from some people in the room who maybe aren't as familiar with Sudan, it's worth sort of charting in some way how we got to where we are. But at the outset, I would say that even though there is a linear sort of trajectory from first the revolution in 2018, 2019, and then the transitional period, and then the coup in 2021, and then sort of the post-coup period, which was fraught with a lot of competition between the various actors in the security state, and then which led to the war. It's wrong to draw the conclusion that the revolution led to the war. Which we're seeing in lots of places, particularly the last place I came across this was when there were protests in Kenya, and a lot of the Kenyans were saying, look at what's happening in Sudan, everybody should go home, we don't want a revolution here. There's a fundamental misreading of how we got to where we are, so I'm hoping that the panel can help elucidate this. But just, I think, to say from the outset, to my mind, the war was caused by the coup. The coup was a flashpoint in the inability of the security state in Sudan to adequately sort out its differences, and having relied upon systems of both oppression, but also a reliance on using guns effectively to do the talking, pretty much led us to where we are today. But if we take a step back, because the revolution is worth looking into, partially because it is being rewritten almost in real time by political actors on different sides of this conflict, but also because in many ways this war can be seen as a counter-revolution. The coup was unsuccessful, and so the way to push back against the revolution was to create a dynamic, a sort of a high-stakes dynamic of that senses violence that could effectively be used to, put an end to many of the different revolutionary forces in Sudan, both literally in terms of, killing off people who work towards democratic gains, but also to delay and defer conversations around how to build a democratic system in Sudan to a much later time. Nobody wants to talk about, as I said earlier, the nuts and bolts of democracy if they are, sort of facing war and famine and all sorts of things. So that, to my mind, is very much where we are. But going back to this idea of revolution, it is important to define, what is a revolution exactly? How do we understand it within the Sudanese space? How do we define it? Whom was it a revolution for? Hamid earlier said that, a lot of people he speaks to frame the revolution in Sudan as sort of a late Arab Spring moment. But if you compare it, let's say, to Egypt, Sudan has had, 3 revolutions. Egypt has had 1. So quite clearly, the parallels are not as easy to draw. Sudan's revolution in 2018, 2019 much more mirrors its own revolutionary history in 1964 and 85 than it does anything in Syria or Libya or Egypt. And then questions around, do we define a revolution by its outcome? Whether it's had a transformative enough change where the systems were really, upended, or do we define it by the political movement and the political work and the revolutionary work that it took to make that revolution coalesce in the first place? That's also something that I want to bring out in this in this panel. And just to, I think it will be useful. It may be useful to some in the room to signpost a few things. One. Political change of any meaningful or significant type has never happened through armed means. Sudan has had a proliferation of different armed groups. None of them have achieved regime change. It's only ever been non-violent political movement. And yet what we have now is very much, this sort of this backlash, if you will, by the security state, by armed actors against non-violent political forces in Sudan that really bring a sizable and significant opposition to them. One way we see this very clearly just on a day-to-day basis is that Sana Hamid, some of you may know her. She's a key Islamist figure of the Bashir era, who's based in Turkey, very much annoyed by how things have turned out for her regime. She was asked by an Al Jazeera host whether the Islamist movement and the Sudanese Armed Forces would ever make peace with the Rapid Support Forces, whom they've now regarded as a terrorist rebel militia. And her answer was yes. To which, of course, the presenter was very puzzled, and he said, but why would you make peace with your sworn enemies whom you're currently fighting? And you've told us that you won't make peace with some of the civilian groups that you have accused of working with that same rebel terrorist militia. And of course, she wasn't able to give a proper answer, but I think what that indicates is that there's a different language is being spoken here. The security service forces can speak to each other because they use the gun to do a lot of their communicating. They're unable to function within a system where it's a very civilianized democratic system. And so that for them is really the principal enemy. And I think in many ways, whether those groups that she's talking about, whether these political elites are fully revolutionary or not, I think is a separate debate. The point is that any civilian nonviolent group, regardless of its politics, is a real threat to the sort of Islamo-military system in Sudan. So that's sort of just a few things that I wanted to signpost above that. And we also see that there are different groups that have been created. The resistance committees that were created over almost a decade before the revolution against Bashir was successful. Now, within the context of the war, we have seen emergency response rooms born out of a similar political cauldron as the resistance committees really take the lead in terms of the humanitarian response. And it really asks the question, in terms of effectiveness, in terms of driving change, is it violence or is it non-violence that can do the most, that is the most transformational? And so with that in mind, I want to turn to the panel and whomever wants to go first, but to really answer the question is, how do you define this revolution, a revolution in Sudan? How do you see the way that revolution links to some of the dynamics that we're seeing within this war, which we can frame as a counter-revolution? And just really to start off by signaling maybe some of the groups that you think had a really key role to play in some of these changes, but also because most of us were there, happy for you guys to also share your experiences of the revolution and the transition, the coup, etc. I think that would paint a really good sort of timeline. Should we start with Hamid?
Sure. Thank you so much, Khulud. So I think, defining the revolution is I think it's not an easy thing to do. But I think what is very different about Sudan's December revolution, 2018, 2019, in comparison to its own history, is that revolutions in 1985 and 1964 were mostly led by elite civil society groups, white collar trade unions, and so on. There are obviously roles played by so many other groups, but these were the groups that were at the forefront of the entire process, and political parties. However, the December Revolution kind of started in a very different way. The groups that were leading the mobilization and the protest and so on were very much grassroots groups. Some were, resistance committees already in some early structures. Some were resistance committees in the making, were not necessarily as organized yet. But these were the type of the groups that were mobilizing and were moving ahead, although there was an important role played by the Sudanese Sudanese Professionals Association in terms of unifying these efforts and so on. But that was only in terms of coordination. And we see how when the Sudanese Professionals Association later on lost direction, if you will, people were able to kind of move ahead without that leadership in place. So that shows you who was really leading the revolution. Also, there were other things that were quite symbolic, although, to be very honest, I think we have never, even throughout the revolution and the transition, really departed from the centralization of politics and, the political discourse on like urban centers in Sudan, particularly in Khartoum and so on. That never really changed. But there were a lot of symbolic things that were quite important in terms of protests starting in other states outside Khartoum before they moved into Khartoum. And that kind of showed that there is this momentum that's building across the country, not necessarily in the urban centers, like it used to happen in the past. But as we moved forward, like I said, I think that did not change per se. But I think, that the revolution, not necessarily because of the slogans that it had, it represented, or so on, because a lot of that we still needed a lot of work to kind of make those slogans into reality. Like Jawhara was saying, we're chanting Kul al-Balad Darfur, all the countries Darfur, and so on. But what did that really mean in reality, and so on? We didn't get to see that through, and so on. But I think what the revolution represented was a space for civilian politics, for civil politics to take place and to be shaped, and for, a space to imagine a different future. Like being at the sit-in in Khartoum was, to me personally, was a transformational experience where you get to meet people from across the country, from places that you have never met before. You would have debates and discussions about political issues, histories, how we experience different things in the country, because such spaces did not exist for us as Sudanese citizens to discuss, things that we have in common and things that, are different between us across the vast country that is Sudan. So I think that was basically what it represented, a space for civilian politics to take shape and form. And that obviously, threatened the other projects that other actors had, not only the military and Islamists who, were very much keen on having an authoritarian military rule in the country, but also elite political groups, including groups that were part of the revolutionary front, if you will, because, they still were interested in a project that re-centralizes power within elites in the center and so on. So that project, obviously, like I said, was threatening to all of them. And why we see now this counter-revolutionary, dimensions to this war, I don't think it's only because we are seeing remnants of the Islamists coming back and because, the military leaders, have in so many ways launched this war against civilians and so on. But I think it's also because there are other international and regional aspects to actors who have been fundamentally against this revolutionary project in Sudan. For instance, the international community, particularly powerful countries in the West and so on, had this security-oriented approach to Sudan, and the political transition, the democratic transition in the country was seen as a very risky, adventure that Sudanese people should not be allowed to embark on, and they had to be kind of, put to limits and so on. And that's why the power sharing agreement with the military forces was in so many ways forced on the Sudanese people, and people were forced to accept it. And that goes to the highest levels of multilateral institutions where, for instance, the Secretary General of the United Nations said the Sudanese people need to be realistic and accept, what is on offer and what is realistic to their context and so on, meaning that they shouldn't ask for a fully civilian governments and cooperate with the military and so on and so forth. Obviously, countries in the region were who have interest in Sudan and so on were also a lot more interested in a military governed state that is weak but stable, that allows them to continue their relations and so on. So that was all happening before the revolution. And we have seen how from the first week of the revolution, the military tried to co-opt the revolution in a way to kind of basically claim it as theirs. And that was the beginning of this counter-revolutionary kind of trend. We've seen how Burhan went into the sit-in just in the first week of the war and started chanting Madaniya, as in civilian rule, tried to co-opt these narratives, and how Hemeti tried to get groups to support him, and there were photos of him at the sit-in being distributed and so on. So I think this counter-revolutionary project has started from the first days of the revolution. And then, obviously, the current war now is the largest manifestation of that. But also actors, international actors, how they continue to legitimize the military leaders as political actors, namely Hemeti and Burhan, after the coup. All diplomats from all countries meeting with them just 2 days after the coup was launched, while the prime minister at the time, Hamdok, was still in prison, but that was a different story. But while that was happening, they were happily meeting with Hemeti and Burhan and legitimizing them as military, as political leaders. So yeah, I think I can stop here and allow others to chip in.
Thanks, Hamid. Jawhara?
Yeah, sure. I think to answer your question about how do we define the revolution, I think for me, the way I look at it as a moment in time that's very similar to the center of an hourglass. Before it, there was lots of grassroots movements, lots of mobilization, civil society action. And after it, there was some fraction in these forces. As I said earlier, I think for me, the moment of the revolution was a moment whereby different groups in different parts of the country that wouldn't necessarily have something in common have managed to be together on the same page regarding their demands and their different asks from the government or the regime at the time. For example, you could see that some people that lived in the periphery in the capital of Khartoum could actually relate to some of the people in Blue Nile or in Mairnu or in Sinnar. The same people could relate to people in Adbara, the same people could relate to people in Al-Fashir. And these are people in different parts of Sudan that had different trajectories throughout the recent history and so on. And I think this particular moment and this particular alignment has challenged the initial notion of a center-periphery kind of distinction, which has been used by armed movements across the country for years. For example, as I said earlier, some parts of the country have had earlier armed revolutions that were ignited because of marginalization, because of their feeling of being marginalized, being on the periphery, and so on. And this has been the notion that was used by most of these armed groups. The revolution was not that, because at the end of the day, this concept of marginalization was not necessarily, of course, marginalization can be a different thing, but it's an abstract form that was used by armed movements. It didn't necessarily relate to someone in Adbara, or it didn't relate to someone in Shimalia. It didn't necessarily.
Sorry, we were struggling to hear you. Is there any way you could get closer to your laptop or something?
Let me try without my headset. Is it better?
Yeah, this is great. Thank you.
Good. Yeah. So I don't know which aspects you guys got or which aspects you missed, but the point that I was stressing at is that it was a moment in time where different people across the country with different struggles and different history were finding an alignment that brought them together, and this was counter to the initial notion of a center preference that was used by armed groups across the recent decades and so on. And this, for example, in Darfur, there was always the notion of marginalization, but in this war, in the revolution, the notion of marginalization was not necessarily being in Khartoum versus being in Al-Fashir. It meant that, you can be in Atbara, you can be marginalized, you can be in Khartoum and be marginalized, you can be in Blue Nile and be marginalized because of your relationship with the power and how the authorities dealt with you and so on. So I think that was unique about that particular moment. Before the revolution, as we always say, that it was not just a one-night thing. So Sudanese civil society have always been organizing and mobilizing in different shapes or forms. And I think so many scholars have been looking at the different ways that this moment has come together and so on. So, for example, the Sudanese society, or the Sudanese civil society and youth specifically, have always been very keen on volunteering in different activities. We've seen how different initiatives have been taking shape and place during flooding times, for example. The Nafir initiatives, the Shara al-Hawadis initiative, which was keen on providing medicine for people, for children in need of medication support and so on. And many others that have over the years accumulated and built trust across the different people. This was one element. The fact that many youth have been involved in many grassroots mobilizing that was about service provision, which was, of course, was a manifestation of the failures of the state, but nonetheless has helped people come together. Another important element is the history of the Sudan, or the legacy of Sudan in previous revolutions. There was already an idea, or there was already some knowledge about the effectiveness of a non-violent action movement in changing the regime and so on. So this also helped the people. And I think another important element, specifically in the area from 2013 to 2018, and just for reference, we did have a revolution or an uprising in 2013 that was severely captured by the regime. But the outcomes, some of the outcomes of that one is that people have changed their tactics. So instead of open kind of what's the right term? Like, instead of openly opposing the regime immediately on the streets without plans, and so on, people resorted to more kind of underground tactics where people would work on trust building, would work on mobilizing underground and so on. And during this period, there were lots of spaces for trainings. I know nowadays there is lots of criticism towards training, especially those provided by NGOs and international community and so on. But the way I look at it is that these trainings have provided some sort of space for people to talk about things that they care about. It's not necessarily about that content of the particular training that was provided, but the fact that a group of youth from different parts of the country, or a group of professionals, or a group of women, or a group of whatever, or a cross-section of all, were able to be in one space where they could talk about certain things and so on. And actually, these factors were heavily researched in a report by Maria and Zahra Haider, and I think it was called Sowing the Seeds of Nonviolent Action in Sudan. Nonetheless, I think these three factors, the trainings, the spaces that were provided through trainings, the legacy of the revolution in Sudan, and the tendency of the younger people of Sudan who were apolitical but willing to change and provide services for people is one of the things that managed to bring this cross-section of people in a particular moment of time that was right for them to ask for political change and so on. After the revolution, what has been fascinating for me personally, and I think it's also for people who have been following the history of nonviolent action in Sudan, is how the different revolutionary forces reorganized themselves in different shapes and forms that were able to take different roles in the community. We've seen how the resistance committees were able for months and years from the revolution to the coup to keep the streets mobilized. We've seen how the service committees been working on provision of bread, or organizing queues, or even providing fuel and so on. So these different roles. I think for me also one particular important aspect was during COVID times, and actually Hamid and I have researched this before, how the revolutionary forces have found a way to substitute the role of the state in areas where the state was not there to provide guidance on how to deal with COVID, how to provide masks and medical services, how to organize people, how to quarantine and these kind of things. So they were shifting as
as the situation needed, and they were actually supplementing the role of the state was deteriorating in many of the areas. And this has taken different shapes depending on the area. In Khartoum, the role of the resistance committees and the service committees was different than in other big cities, was different than IDP camps, and was different than other ones, and so on. So this is also another indicator that the revolutionary forces were indeed a true manifestation of the needs of the community, and so on. Continuing to follow this in the war, of course, most of the people in the room would be following the work of the emergency response room, so I wouldn't say much about it, but I think this is also another example of how these forces have been resilient in trying to fill the gap. Of course, now it's extreme oppression, it's extreme violence, the situation is very complicated, but nonetheless, the resistance committees and other active members have managed to mobilize around providing services and so on. I think the last thing that I would wrap up this intervention with is what I started, the metaphor that I started with. I don't even know how accurate is that, but the hourglass shape. If we look at it, we started from a bigger kind of group of people to a particular moment where people were unified, and now unfortunately we're heading towards a fraction again, because now after the war people are taking sides. Every day we get surprised by people that we met at the sit-in, that we joined like different marches with. We planned for things together, taking a side of one side of the war. We've seen how younger people were taking arms in the side of the army and taking arms in the side of RSF. My worry is that momentum that has been built over the years, because of the inability to sustain it at the moment, and because of the extreme oppression and the need for one to protect themselves, is going to be lost in this war if it continues to prolong and so on. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to discuss anything further if needed.
Thank you so much, Johara. This is for Hamid too. Yasmin, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I mean, thank you both, Johara and Hamid. There's so much there to kind of pick up on. I'm quite keen to sort of put the counter-revolution, the revolution, and in context and kind of work backwards a little bit. And Johara mentioned 2013, and I remember being in Sudan in 2012, sort of one of the early English language bloggers about kind of the initial, like there was a larger moment in 2013, but in 2012, there was also like an attempt, people going out onto the streets, similar to what, people being inspired by what was happening in Egypt and Tunisia and so on. And I think what's, for context, maybe everyone in the room knows, but, the post-Bashir era, or the Bashir era, was an era of like intense isolation and also intense repression, which meant you had a generation that had to learn how to use the muscle of organizing, and there had been what Bashir's regime did effectively was dismantle a lot of those structures, the unions and so on, or sort of take the sting out of a lot of them. And so you had a generation that had to learn how to organize again. And what's quite interesting is that if you look at 2012 and 2013, you had people who were probably teenagers, early 20s, who then learned the lessons, looked at what happened in Egypt and so on, looked at what didn't work in 2013, and I think found the opportunity in 1819 to sort of to realize a different outcome. Now, the question of what we consider a revolution to be is quite interesting to me. I love the idea of the revolution as a moment in time, the most narrow point of an hourglass. And I think if we consider the revolution as a moment in time, then we can argue that it actually succeeded. It succeeded in its mission to, remove Bashir. You could argue that that's the case. But I think one would also make the argument that revolutions are never simply just simple moments in time, but they're something that are constantly being contested, rewritten, and so on. And so the thing that I find curious about Sudan is we are able to dismantle, or we're able to sort of bring down particular leaders through nonviolent political movement, and have done so effectively over many decades, but we are unable to govern without a military force, right? So we tend to see the change happen non-violently, but the governance of the state happens violently. And I would argue that that's actually directly connected to the colonial history of the state. And I think a challenge for decolonization as a whole. How do you, if you have succeeded at formal independence through military means, or if you've kind of gone through a violent decolonial process, which many places have, like from the British, or we've also got the Arab Ottoman Empire and so on to contend with. How do you then, if that is the model by which you become a state, a nation state in the modern sense, how do you change and transform into any other type of governance? And that, I think, is a question that is live for Sudan, as it is lots of other countries around the world. And I'm not sure that we have quite figured that out. And that, for me, is the underlying, the challenge, what we see in the counter-revolution. But it's also not just what happens within the borders of Sudan, but it is in the way that countries and other states and other actors relate to Sudan. What do I mean by that? As was previously pointed out, the people that other states, INGOs, the United Nations, everyone wants to just deal with one or two leaders. They want to deal with the generals, the people they feel comfortable with, the people they understand, the people they know have a sense of control. They don't want to deal with 50 resistance committees. They're uninterested in the risk, the mess, the whatever, despite that aim, like perhaps being the most effective or the truest will of the people, despite the people themselves, like Sudanese people, time and time and time again, across every, whether it was from the grassroots, whether it was people in the room saying, do not trust these generals are not good faith actors. They will go against their word. And that was completely ignored. However, if we look today, those very same, US, American, diplomats and so on sort of admit that they made a mistake. We shouldn't have actually agreed and gone into an agreement with these generals. And so we're in the same position, but not necessarily by our own making. We are in the position that we are, partly also because the international community is more interested in, I think the phrase was the securitization approach to Sudan, or more interested in not having to actually deal with the country, right? Not having to actually deal with the people, but just to have it under control, right? And I think this is one of the other real problems that we face in this current moment. Yes, there is the sort of the broader counter-revolutionary moves that are happening domestically within the borders, and we kind of understand the impact of that. But also, we are in a region that is very important and very volatile at the moment, and we are not the main concern. Right? The United States isn't actually that interested in what happens in Sudan. They just don't want to have to think about it, right? You've got actors like Russia, you've got the United Arab Emirates, you've got all of these actors who are largely interested in just not having to worry about it, being able to extract what they need and, not really worrying about the rest. All of this other stuff to them is a distraction, right? And so I think that is the sort of real politic, unfortunately, is that because Sudan can be understood as collateral, any demands are seen as like an annoyance rather than as the kind of basic necessary requirement for all of these other actors to kind of get what they want. And so I think that is in some ways, I personally, when I think about it, I'm like, oh, this is the curse of being, of trying to sort of be a Sudanese person, wanting a civilian life, wanting to be able to live freely, is that nobody else is actually invested in the Sudanese people's freedom apart from Sudanese people. In fact, everybody else seems to be interested and invested in anything but our security and our safety and our prosperity. And the revolution in 1819 succeeded because young people felt like they had nothing to lose to some extent. I think they felt like it was this or we die, right? That was the kind of the statement. It's Madaniya, and now it's more than nothing to lose. Now everything, once you've kind of gone past that point, then then how do you sort of give people things to hold on to? And this is where I fear, the propaganda that was talked about, the people feeling like they have to choose sides, the rewriting of the revolution, the story of the revolution, the story of Sudan. I think there is danger there, which is why I think I am also personally invested in making sure that we, even while we are going through this process, we are writing a story that is somehow more truthful. And also honoring, and I'm going to pick up something that Hamid said earlier, the transformation that occurred, right? Because I think Sudanese people were transformed, right? Sort of psychically at some way through this revolution. And we are not the same as 2017 Sudanese people. We will never be the same as we were in pre the revolution. It remains to be seen where we will end up. That's all for me.
Thank you, Yasmin. Nasreen.
So, I think I remember when the revolution, I was not in Sudan when the revolution broke out, although my father, who was at the time, I think 86, was out there on the streets, and I would get messages from him being like, I figured out how to protect myself from the tear gas with neem leaves and things like that. It was like giving me a heart attack. But in any case, I remember when we first started talking about the revolution in the diaspora to non-Sudanese audiences, people kept questioning whether or not it was a real revolution. And, as an anthropologist, I would go back and ask, well, what language were people in Sudan using? They were using the word thora. And in many ways, it was, to me, a kind of unique coming together of these kind of economic demands around economic justice and sort of land reform in the center were converging with these more decade-old struggles for self-determination and justice in Sudan's kind of so-called periphery. This was a less middle-class, less urban-led revolution. It was decentralized, right? Like it emerged out of Atbara, Mairnud, Damazin, before it kind of came to the center. And for some people, it's sort of fatally centralized, actually. But in any case, part of what, in the beginning at least, I kept thinking about was, how does what is happening in Sudan demand a different vocabulary around what revolution is and what it means? I think we've always used kind of the American, the French Revolution maybe as the kind of prototype of what a revolution is, right? You overthrow the monarchy or whatever, and the outcome is sort of more important than the process. And I think what Sudan has demonstrated is that revolutions go through a kind of protracted process, a kind of dialectical process, right, of like revolution, counter-revolution. And one of the most inspiring things to me was that you saw people, friends of mine who worked at the UN, say, who were annoyed that there were long lines to get their cash out, who were at the sit-in with people who had come all the way from Niala, who had been displaced multiple times, right? And so they were all coming together in this one centralized place. There was a lot of political education happening. There was a lot of transformation that was happening, which I think is one of the things that was very powerful about the revolution. Like you said, I don't think anybody sort of, came out of this. Everybody came out of it changed, even those of us in the diaspora, I would say. But I think that, there's kind of one of the things that really inspired me was that the counter-revolution started pretty much at the same time as the revolution, right? I mean, especially after Bashir was ousted, it's like immediate. The Transitional Military Council took over, and even I remember this right before al-Bashir was ousted, so we were still dealing with, the regime. The Americans sent a delegation to discuss kind of investment opportunities. Which was like, okay, there's regime change on the horizon. Let's talk about how to exploit resources because the Clinton sanctions had still been, were still in place, et cetera. And then also, of course, as we've all talked about after the coup, there was really, I think we saw kind of international diplomacy as a tool of empire working at that time, really making sure that, they prioritize kind of stability over revolutionary demands, really sidelined the resistance committees. But at the same time, there was a parallel process of the resistance committees and other kind of civil society formations, working class unions, youth formations, feminist organizations, etc., who mostly were sidelined in the kind of during the transition period and when the transitional government was forming and after that, who continued to do the work of the civilian state in its absence. Right? So you saw, and even before the revolution, 2013, these resistance committees kind of emerged. You had protests in 2011, I guess 2012, 2013, 2016. But in 2013 is really when the resistance committees emerge. And they're not only organizing protests, they're also, as we've all talked about, organizing around flood relief. They're doing COVID prevention later on, right? They're doing, like mosque cleanups and kind of school, beautification projects, and they're organizing against land grabs. I wrote a piece following a case in 2013 in Dom, where a community found out about a secret deal that had been signed with a Saudi investor for land in their community, who then pushed back through a 4-day sit-in. That was, the protests were first kind of dispersed through tear gas. Then there was a sit-in. They drew in communities from all across Sharq al-Nil, like that kind of area, and then eventually pushed the police back and managed to kind of regain that land. The aftermath of it is a bit depressing because people then ended up using the law, which is, I think, one of the reasons we need to change the legal framework, right, through which people advocate for justice. It's in and of itself flawed. It needs to be changed. But to me, it was sort of a microcosm or maybe an oracle, I don't know, a predictor of what was then to come during the revolution, is that people were involving each other in each other's struggles and supporting each other and learning in the process how to organize themselves in the absence of a state. And so if there's anything hopeful to take from this moment, it's that clearly civilians are able to run a country without a state, right? If we look at the emergency response rooms, that's actually what's happening. And so for me, even though, again, the emergency response rooms are generally seen as a non-political kind of form of volunteerism, I do think we have to ask ourselves, there is I think, political potential for them, especially if they don't get co-opted by, I'm not going to name who, but, there are forces that have been trying to co-opt them. And I think that there is a way that, to me at least, it shows us, that the revolution continues in some form, that it evolves, right, as the kind of pendulum swing of the counter-revolution. I mean, it's partly so forceful because of how powerful the revolution was, right? And because there are external forces that are trying to return us to what was before, which is the danger, I think, here. And so, yeah, I think I'll just end there. I think for me, there is also a kernel of hope there that we're like really demonstrating to the rest of the world, which is, I think, different from even the Arab Spring, like as such. To me, we've actually, because after the revolution, the revolution has ended, but after that period, the resistance committees took on a labor that was slower, more deliberate in trying to build towards something. And that I don't think we've really seen. Again, maybe I'm ignorant, but we haven't seen that in the region in the same way, I would say. Yeah.
That's true. Thanks so much, everyone. Yeah. I think that's a really key point that you've all picked up on, which is that this is because Sudan's history is so cyclical, we anticipate that at some point this revolution will rear its head again. And because so much of the groundwork was done in 2018, 2019, actually very different to the 60s and the 80s. In those days, it took a few days, maximum a week, to bring down a dictator. In 2018, 2019, it was 6 months and then a sit-in. It's a much slower process. There's a lot more to learn from in terms of how things manifested. And we still see signs that the revolution has not been diminished. We still see, a lot of cross-learning that has happened. As you say, the ERRs are effectively modeling what the revolution really called for, civilian governance, etc. And as the Egyptian revolutionary says, we have not yet been defeated, right? So there's still always, as you say, this kernel of hope. So I want to open up for questions, but I also want you to consider how we get back through this morass, through this war, through all of this violence, how we get back to a space where it is sort of, we are still building the blocks of what could come next, that sort of revolutionary ideal that we want. But I know that we don't have much time, so I also want to open up the floor for questions. Any questions? Sarah?
So thank you so much for everything you guys said. It was really brilliant. I do want to just kind of ask, in the conversation around counter-revolution, we often speak about the outside forces. We don't really speak also about the role of us as Sudanese people in the counter-revolution, which is something I really like to discuss, because I think part of our biggest downfall is this idea that we're a good people. This is, to me, such a false narrative, and it actually dehumanizes who we are, and it allows us to also be blind to the counter-revolution inside of it. So, for example, during the sit-ins, the numbers of sexual harassment reports went through the roof. When we discuss also like a lot of microaggressions against different people from different tribes, from different regions, also started to come forth. And as soon as now things reach Khartoum and everyone's left, the nostalgia, the heroine of all emotions, has made so many people crave the idea of military rule again. And as someone who was also, around in Egypt also when the revolution happened in Egypt, watching also that counter-revolution pendulum swing, as you put it, come from the mouths of the people demanding a military rule. How do we sidestep this trap for ourselves? That's my question.
That's a great question, Ibrahim.
I'll start with the opposing position, and I quote here the statement of a Sudanese political leader. I think most of you know him. He's stating that the revolutions is the greatest threat of countries, while or have been. So, starting from this position, and we know that Sudan history is full of revolutions. And we consider these revolutions are great achievements of Sudanese people, but we don't see very long-term impact for Sudan after 3 revolutions and 3 steps of presidents. We don't see that progress and achievements. And also considering that youth are the majority of population in Sudan. Some say that 79% of Sudanese population are under 40. This is a huge energy. And this money to achieve success in 3 revolutions. But considering also this huge energy with lack of capacity and awareness of working in civil and political and public wars in general. So my question is the revolution is a good thing for such countries like Sudan with very suppressive dictatorships that didn't give any space for those people to develop or to work publicly in a good way? And how could we achieve good results and outcomes of the revolutions if we consider that revolution is a good thing?
Thank you. Are there any more questions in the room, or should we see if there are any questions online? Oh, please. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you all again. Amazing, per usual. My question is about violence and the notion of revolutionary violence. There seemed to be a divide between civilian rule and military rule that I'm picking up on. And I'm wondering if it's possible, one, to non-violently demilitarize Islamo-militant state. And if it's not, then how does this change our view of violence or the capacities of violence? Or another way to put it would be, is violence always something that we want to step away from or fix, or is it a kind of energy that we want to harness and rework for revolutionary purposes? Or do we understand violence again to be kind of essentially a problem rather than another vector of possible strategic political movement. Does that make sense as a question? Okay.
Hamid, do you want to start?
Sorry, was trying to unmute. Yes, happy to start. I think I just want to, before going to the questions, I want to offer, like, I think to the counter the idea of the Sudanese revolution as only a moment in history. I think how I see it, I think it's goes a lot in line with what the Soviet political scientist Leon Trotsky defines as the idea of a permanent revolution. And you see that in the slogans of the resistance committees, and so on. And I think what Jawhar spoke about in terms of how the roles that these resistance committees keep on changing and adapting to the context and so on, I think that is definitely part of this idea of a permanent revolution that is ongoing and goes through different phases, including this reverse that is happening at the moment. But I think it's part of the whole story, and I hope it ends in a brighter. I think I will start with a question on whether revolutions in contexts like Sudan, where it's very fragile, where it's a very volatile context, if you like, if it's a good idea and whether that would have good outcomes or not. I think there's something that, the scholar Amartya Sen kind of speaks about a lot about, democracy and the idea of democracy and who is fit and which nations are fit for democracy and which nations are not. And historically, there's been a lot of theories about how countries, there are specific conditions that you need to meet as a nation and so on, so that you could, start getting into a process towards democratization and so on. But what Amartya Sen says and kind of brings a lot of stories from the global south and so on is that a country does not become there are no countries that are, or people who are unfit for democracy, that countries and nations become fit through democracy. So you have to go through the process to get, to be ready for the new system or so on. So I think what I'm trying to say is that I don't think, particularly in Sudan, that the country was not ready for a revolution or that there were any other ways to bring about political change. I think, we have seen, in the history, seldom has there been any real progress towards, bringing justice, accountability, and democracy and so on by compromise from political elites or the military or so on. It has to be, in a revolutionary way where you're trying to change things. But also, I think specifically in Sudan, there's honestly, as risky as it is, as difficult as it is, I don't see any other way, because if we continue trying to bring about democratization or political change through elite processes like we have done in the past and so on, you are only changing the political leaders who are governing the country, and you're replacing, an elite, centralized, authoritarian in many ways regime with another. But there are so many layers to what is wrong with the Sudanese state, and we have discussed that, in detail today. And I think changing all of that cannot happen without starting from the bottom through a revolution. Otherwise, there is no other way. And I think, honestly, I don't think that the Sudanese people lack political awareness or savviness or understanding of the political dynamics and so on. I think, honestly, I live currently in the UK, even like, and as you see, like the past month or so in the UK, there were far right protests, and across the past year there have been protests by the Palestinian pro-Palestinian movement and so on. So there have been a lot of political movement on the streets taking place, and I think engaging in that and engaging in the Sudanese revolution, honestly, I think the Sudanese I might be biased here, but I think the Sudanese people who were part of the revolution had a lot more savviness and understanding of the issues, and were able to articulate their thoughts a lot better. So I don't think, there was an issue of the Sudanese people not being ready or fit for the revolution. It was rather that all forces, imperialist, colonial, neo-colonial, internal, external, and so on, in so many ways conspired against the revolution and made sure that it doesn't, come to fruition and so on. I will leave the other questions to other people.
Thanks, Hamid. Jawhara?
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to start by 2 points that I've forgot to mention earlier, and I'll make them brief. The first one is about the different manifestations after the revolution. Nasreen has mentioned the sit-ins that took place in a particular area. That was a phenomenon that we've witnessed in different places. For example, in Darfur, we have witnessed the first environmental sit-in in Africa, where people were literally protesting, cutting trees in their areas because of issues of deforestation and so on and so forth. So this revolution has translated into a very localized way of demanding change. We've also seen the different sit-ins across Darfur, in Nertiti, in Fatabarno, and Mystery, and different parts where people were asking for local needs, be it like safety, be it like access to farmland, be it protection from thieves and these kind of things. So this was another aspect that, beyond the service committees and the resistance committees, has translated into local communities and their daily needs and so on. The second point, which adds to the conversation about the counter-revolution, is that I think because the revolution has managed to be to make this cross-cutting kind of connection among different classes and different groups of the community, it has been the enemy of different peoples that have been manifesting on binary narratives of Sudan. For example, people who have been investing in the narrative of the center periphery, of the people that have been investing in the narrative of upper class and lower class, in the peoples that have been investing in the binary of civilian and military rule. And this is why we see even now, within the current war, the resistance committees, the revolutionary forces, the EARs are being fought by everyone in areas held by different armed groups, in areas different by the two warring parties, and in different aspects. Because at the end of the day, they know that, or we know that at the end of the day, as you mentioned, Khulud, these people can make a peace deal, but at the end of the day, it's the revolutionary forces that are going to be opposing whatever things that doesn't fall in line with their demands and so on. So this has the 2 points that I wanted to add. 1 second, let me just get some. Yeah. To answer some of the questions, and I think Hamid has already partially answered this one, on whether we were fit for a revolution or not. I think sometimes as time moves on, we forget how dire the times were when that revolution started. I think people didn't have many options at the time. So the first option was the nonviolent revolution. The second one was to continue living under Bashir regime, which I don't think I need to remind people how awful it was for the majority of the Sudanese people. And the third option was resorting to violence and a violent kind of change of regime, which a situation we ended up in. But I think at that time, what was very dangerous about this is that Sudan has a very violent history that was taking shape in different parts of the country. And we were worried that this is going to expand to include all the countries. So actually, logically speaking, this was the most logical option, even if we don't necessarily subscribe to non-violent kind of approach of change and so on. And this is why we've seen during the revolutions that even people that were part of some of the armed movements, themselves sided with the revolution because this was the most logical option, regardless of all the other factors that we were looking at and so on. So I think it's not like we had a menu of options and we chose the non-violent one because, we had the luxury of choosing. It was just the most logical one and so on, regardless of whether we believe on the violent or non-violent action ways of change and so on. That being said, there was also a comment about whether violence can be a tool or not. I think in the Sudan context, that was not a viable option, specifically because of what I've mentioned. We've seen how violence manifests in Sudan. We are a country that's home to a genocide. We are a country that's home to ethnic cleansing. We are a country where we have massive amounts of militias. We are a country where violence is not manipulated, monopolized by the state. And we are a country that has a very large tendency of falling into violence, and we've seen that now. So I think at the time we just didn't want to go down that route because we know what it would turn out to be, and this is what we're seeing now. So I don't think violence was an option for us.
Thanks so much, Johara. Nismeen?
Sorry, maybe I'll start with the last question, building on that question of violence. And I don't know if this is a philosophy that is applicable to everyone, but I think personally, this current war, I think as I have gotten older, I am more and more committed to a philosophy of nonviolence because I cannot see how picking up arms leads to the end of violence, if that makes sense. I think any sort of peace agreement, any treaty, any step towards a life that the populace requires people to put their guns down and to sit at the table. And so I would prefer not to have picked up the gun at all, I think. And maybe, maybe that's, I think when I was younger, I used to think there was like a nobility to a revolutionary violence, right? You grow up with learning about versions of, the version of the Malcolm X that said by any means necessary and so on, like that is romanticized to a certain extent. But I think once I became a student of our own history and a student of history in the region, it becomes a very slippery slope. And also there is no nuance in that language. There is no nuance in the language of violence. And there's also something to me, and this might be glib, so hyper-masculine about trying to control and coerce and force a people into submission. And I feel like, or maybe patriarchal is another term for it, but I feel like we have to believe that alternate ways are possible. Now, the question of how you sort of demilitarize a society, I think is a more challenging one. And I also think it takes time. I think perhaps sometimes we want things to happen in our lifetimes or in, a 15-year period rather than in a 200-year period, which is how, it happened for lots of other countries around the world. And so I think I am less exercised about the fact that there have been numerous revolutions and yet we haven't kind of gotten to that stable, peaceful place that we're all hoping for, inshallah. Because I do believe that this process, whether it's a permanent revolution, whether it's just us continuing to experiment until we get closer and closer and closer to the thing that will work for us, because I think that's what we have to do, is find the thing that works for us. And just to kind of maybe end on a saddest question, which was around, how do we deal with the counter-revolution from within? I think part of that is the work that happened or that started in the December Revolution, which is that consciousness raising, that education, that reminding, because I think something that the Bashir regime did successfully was they hollowed out the education systems. They put in, the person who had the right political connections and was loyal into a post rather than the person who was like the most meritocratic or had the knowledge or had the whatever. And so we did lose, and there was a mass exodus as well of people who were invested in education. And I know it feels glib to say education, but I do think we can't underestimate the kind of value. And that is some of the work that the resistance committees were doing. I remember so distinctly that when there were power outages and when there were internet outages during the revolution, the things that we would hear are the resistance committees going from door to door, gathering people, to having teach-ins and so on. And that was a key part of the process in order to allow everyday people to feel invested, to understand what was going on and I think that kind of education has to continue and is the only way that we can kind of resist from within. Thanks.
You, Nasreen?
Let's see. I think the question of violence, I mean, I think one of the things that's important to note is that if we look at the history of kind of resistance against the state in Sudan, nobody took up arms randomly or, right? Like everybody who took up arms, every group that took up arms after nonviolent means were brutally crushed. And in many ways, I think those of us who are from the North and Center have the privilege of kind of foregrounding nonviolence as an ideology rather than as a tactic or strategy in a way that other people might not have had the privilege to do. So I think that's one thing. I mean, one of the saddest things about the current situation is people taking up arms for SAF. And I'm like, at least take up arms like for yourself, like against the oppressive, So it's not obviously, I mean, people are trying to frame it as a revolutionary violence, but it's not, But I do appreciate the question because I think it is an important one for us to figure out. Will they ever? I mean, I talked to a Colombian friend of mine who said, part of what you're dealing with in Sudan is that so many people are armed. It's like a huge number of people. We're talking about, I think, 120,000 on each side, which even in the Colombian context, I think it was like 15,000 or something at its height. So we're really dealing with, obviously, a process of demilitarization that will have to happen at some point that is going to be really, really challenging, especially if we're not, coming up with ways of people making a living, right? And giving people other means of surviving. I want to pick up on something that Johara said. Part of what I think I really appreciated in the aftermath of kind of after the sit-in after the massacre, the June massacre that broke up the sit-in, is that we saw a kind of unprecedented history. I mean, there's always been this, but like in a way, almost like concentrated history of civil disobedience. You had some of the longest labor strikes in Sudan's history. You had communities, in Kordofan, for example, and other mining areas organizing sometimes successfully against the use of like harmful toxic chemicals in mining. You had, teachers striking, the sit-ins that Johara was talking about. I mean, it was actually really, I hope somebody does a dissertation or a book on this because it was really quite amazing. And so I think in that way, the decentralization, again, this is something I used to organize in the US context. And we always talk about, yes, vote, clear, like do vote, for this election is going to be a mess, but, whoever you're going to vote for. But it's really the local politics that matter, right? Like the people at the city council level, the people who sit on the school board. And I think there is some of that as well in the Sudanese context, is that people were feeling empowered to kind of say, I'm done. Like I worked with some women harvesters in the Jazeera, and the agricultural sector has really become more and more feminized, who decided one day they weren't going to go to work until their wages doubled. And, and these, it was the landowner had no other choice because like, what else is he going to do, And it was like, I think he was paying them like $2 a day or something. So it was about time. And then finally, I think the point, Al-Sada's point, I think is a very, very important one. I think we'll probably address it even like in the next session. But I would really like us to talk more about the role that we ourselves have been playing in the counter-revolution. Especially people in the diaspora who, for example, were handpicked to be part of the transitional government. The people who are talking about like the DAL kind of investment model, right? The people who essentially want us to go back to, I don't know, pre-coup, right? Which is not where we need to be. And it's, and it's kind of concerning to me. I think, again, I don't know if that's exactly who we're talking about. But I think that is something we need to have a conversation about, and how sometimes I think those civilian elites really did more damage than it's kind of like what brought us partly in this mess. So.
It's watching play out now, also carrying the torch of being the voice of Sudan, and really repeating the same what I've seen is the same downfalls, repeating those again in the diaspora, putting themselves as the only face and narrative of Sudan, and really leaning into their victimhood in a way that's just too much. You know, and ignoring completely what happened everywhere else around Sudan and what their role was in that. And it's really more scary also to see it in the younger kids, like people who are under. Oh, sorry.
It's also really more scary for me to see it in younger generations who are really new to being organizers, really new to working, and really unaware of their privileged space in Sudanese society. So even when they talk about it from a very token space. There's very little actual knowledge. And while I'm really happy to see, you know, media, especially the media stuff, because I'm more of a cultural person. So like I'm watching this rise in diasporic storytelling about what it means to be Sudanese, and this nostalgia and this romanticization and all about our heritage, our vintageness, and it all stems to basically the 1950s. And nowhere outside of that center, nowhere outside of that thing, even the way we discuss education amongst ourselves and knowledge passing and all of that. It's just a little bit, I'm a little scared. I'm really scared for us. And so that's why I'm like bringing it up.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point.
Thanks for that. Hamida, you had a hand up earlier. Did you just want to come in quickly?
No, I think Nasreen said most of what I wanted to say, but I think in the heat of the moment during the revolution, I think this is a response to what Alsara was speaking about right now. I think our roles as citizens in this counter revolution, but I think ever since the revolution was starting and so on, I think in the heat of the moment, it was easy for us to all come around this big cause, but I think we forgot that we all wanted different things from the revolution, and we all, on a personal level, had very different stakes and so on. And I think there was, in the moment, we did not see it as elusive as it is now, but there was an assumption that this revolution would transform us overnight and we will become a different nation, and we would not have issues at all and so on. And I think we were all we bought into that, but now we see this as how elusive it was. And I think we all needed to go through this emancipatory process where we would free ourselves from all these issues that because many of us have became agents of our oppressors for so many reasons. So I think it would have been a work in process, but also that was one of the processes that were cut short, and now the war is making it worse.
Thanks, Hamid. I thought we ended at 3, so I was stealing time, but actually we ended 3:15, so we have a bit more time. So if anybody wants to come in, please raise your hand. Yasmin, is that a hand?
Awesome.
No, I just wanted to comment very briefly on 2 things. One is Ibrahim's question. I think oftentimes revolution is framed, or sort of transformative change is framed as this sort of blue sky thinking. Oh, how naive you are that you want to change things. But in Sudan, we've honestly been through every kind of system and none of them have worked. So actually, rather than being the idealistic view, revolution towards civilian democratic change is the only practical option that there is. And the reason I put it that way is that there are so many conversations I have had with members of the international community who, as you said, one of you said earlier, I think Hamid said it too, every diplomat I spoke to around the time of the revolution said to me, well, this is never going to work. The Bashir regime is so strong. There's no way you guys will ever upend it. And in many ways, they believed in the strength of the Bashir regime far more than we did. And that was one, frankly, obstacle we didn't need, because of course this manifested in many other ways as well. But when the change did happen, of course, the international community was completely unable to engage with it because they hadn't anticipated it. But I think a lot of people in Sudan recognize that there is no other way but to seek a change from a militarized regime. We're not fighting Aboud or Nimeri or Bashir. These people are manifestations of that militarized system in Sudan that we've never been able to get rid of. So the problem is not these people. The problem is the system. And as long as we remain in the system, we're not going to be able to get out of the cycle of wars, right? Because if your political language is through violence, is through the gun, then you will have to continue speaking that language to get anything done. And just to your question, Jordan, we have Sudan in 1955, 56 had one armed movement. By the 90s, there were maybe one or two. Now we have dozens. Because every single political process that we've had has rewarded people who have sought political change through violence. But none of these people have been able to achieve anything that they built a constituency around. So even if they have, a slice of the pie within a peace agreement, even if they get a government position, they're never really able to give their constituencies what they want. So they themselves then start lacking the legitimacy to continue and just become puppets. And that is the cycle that they are trapped in. And so I think one of the reasons why so many people, get away from this idea of a violent transition or a violent push is that actually that it doesn't end in the way that they want it to. And even if the peaceful means and non-violent means don't necessarily end in the way we want it to, it's much more sustainable. And I like that Hamid brought up this idea of a permanent revolution because it does seem like we are very much in that. But to Al-Sarrar's point as well, there are many traps here, right? There's a trap that the civilian elites want us to sort of drop into. And there's a trap that military actors want us to drop into as well. And if you have been tracking, I'm sure many of you have, that the different armed actors, but in particular the Sudanese Armed Forces, has been pushing for this narrative online for people calling for a return of military rule, that military rule is the only way that Sudan will be peaceful, which of course is completely inimical to everything we know and understand and Sudan's own history. But they're going through a process which is very obvious. And it's also very craven, this idea of manufacturing consent for military rule. And, you see that also in the way that they have been saying, once we take over, it's 20 years of military rule and everybody just has to, sort of put up and shut up. And it reminds me of something that Mansour Khalid said, this great Sudanese intellectual, who at one time had sided with one of the rebel movements that we had in Sudan, the SPLM. And Mansour Khalid used to say that Sudanese people get the government they deserve. And I used to always be really annoyed by that because living in Sudan during the Bashir period, I was like, how dare he think that we in any way, shape or form, A, want this or B, deserve this? And I was really sort of, aggrieved by the fact that he would say that. But watching how people are now calling for a return of, military rule, calling for the Sudanese Armed Forces to take over, I'm like, right, this is what he meant. That effectively people will choose what is in many ways the easy way out because it's being decided by somebody else. They get to defer responsibility to somebody else because, of course, civilian democratic rule is a responsibility and it's a big responsibility and it's something you have to work at. But actually, it's much better to just outsource to somebody, the SAF or whomever it is, and they'll just take care of it. So I think how we get past that, how we make sure we don't fall into any of those traps, the elite trap, the civilian trap, or the military trap, is to do what you've said, Yasmin, which is constantly, sort of work at it to make sure that we counter all the harmful narratives that we know, very obvious and we've seen them before, but also to recognize that just because something didn't work out the way that we wanted it to Ibrahim's point, doesn't mean that we just have to, sort of leave it be. That this does require every single one of us to be pushing in a specific, particular direction. I may want very different things from you when that civilian democratic government happens. But the point is, we will both be able to engage on it without picking up a gun and without harming other people, and actually be able to inculcate a system where it doesn't matter what we think, all of us get a fair shake at life. So I think that's the way to counteract that. But there's some very pernicious trends, I think, that we're seeing in this war, in the way that the counter-revolution has sort of the empire is striking back in many ways. And we're seeing that, sort of and we need to do the same effectively. We need to be just as, match their energy effectively in terms of pushing back against these things. But I invite anybody from the floor before we end, if they have any comments, Nasreen, please. Yes.
So I was wondering, because I've been thinking about this a lot. You have talked, Khulud, about how peace, there have been dozens of peace agreements, none of which have led to peace. Or
agreement.
Sorry? Agreement, yeah, that's true. And how peace has sort of become a currency in a way for certain, the kind of heads of armed groups to gain, I mean, the Juba peace agreement is an example of that, right? Of people amassing kind of wealth and power through that. So given that history of kind of peace becoming a currency in this way, because I'm sure you get asked this a lot, like, what is the way out? How do we negotiate at least a ceasefire? But it seems like the framework itself, the very kind of sitting at one table to legitimize the people who are responsible for this, right? To prop them up as potential reformists who are going to get us closer to whatever, is in and of itself a way of prolonging the war, legitimizing it, right? Et cetera. And it's like something I've been thinking about, like, what is an alternative model to this? How else do we do this? I'm not close to that world at all. So I was just wondering what you think.
Oh, sure. It's not in response to that question, so I will look forward to your response, Khulud. A couple of things that came to mind as you were speaking, Khulud. One is this concept of surviving victory. And a writer I know who had studied revolutions in post-Soviet Union countries was kind of talking about this idea of surviving victory. Like you have the revolution, you kind of have this moment of victory, but then how do you actually survive it? And I think, and that to me is the question that I've constantly been thinking about. Like, how do we survive the moment that we've been kind of hoping for, fighting for, and so on? And maybe that survival is, this counter-revolution is, I guess, the work of surviving, right? And the other phrase that came to mind as you were talking, Khulud, was this idea of political labor. I don't think of myself as somebody who is partisan to any of, like, there is no current sort of political party in Sudan that I have any allegiance to. I don't think it's possible for, like, I don't think they're fit for purpose. And it's fascinating to me to see us governing ourselves already through all of the various groups that we've spoken about, the emergency response rooms, the resistance committees, us doing the work of looking after each other, which begs the question of the point of the state, but that's a separate conversation. But the political labor of continuing to do the work of do the political work in order to allow for everybody to be able to just live their lives. Because I do think there's something like most of my mother's family is uninterested in politics, deeply uninterested and actually afraid of it, because politics has only been a dangerous thing. Politics has been the reason people got arrested, disappeared, tortured, etc. And they didn't want any part of it. They just want, and so for them, the revolution was actually a scary thing up until a moment, and then it became exciting because there was an opening for something new and something possible. And now the story is uncertain, right? Now the story for those who managed to escape is like, how do we just wait for this to pass until we can go back? And for those who are still in the country, it is just a question of when will this be over? And what they want to quote unquote go back to, there's almost like a question mark of what time period they want to go back to, because it's so all consuming. And so I often think of that part of my family as an interesting barometer for the Sudanese person, in the sense that I think often folks that are most political, they're all deeply aware of the politics, but not necessarily interested in engaging with it. And I guess what I'm trying to tease out is, it is a privilege to not have to engage with politics, right? Like, if we look at where we are in the United States today, you can choose not to vote. And for many people, that may or may not have an impact on your day-to-day life, on whether the bins get collected, what have you, right? But I think in the Sudanese context, politics has been something that does impact in everybody's day-to-day life, and people can try to kind of ignore it as much as they possibly can in order to live their lives if they have a particular class or ethnic privilege. Sorry, I'm sort of losing my thread slightly here. I thought I really knew where I was going, and then it kind of evaporated. But I suppose really what I want to come back to is the idea of the importance of doing that political labor, and understanding that political labor is actually separate to party politics. It's separate to like choosing a side. It's about reinforcing that message of like, what is the work that we're doing in order to enable as many people as possible to live the lives that they want to, so they don't have to think about the work of politics on the day-to-day, to allow, this is the point I was going to make. The easy choice at the moment is to follow the loudest message, which is a return to military government, right? It's a return to military rule. That is the sort of the message that is being foghorned out. And there is a familiarity there. I remember talking to friends in Egypt who were kind of like, we just want to go back to the military because that's at least we know how to operate under that. At least we know how to operate under that. And that is not where we want to end up, right? We don't want to end up having just to go back to like an evil that we know because we don't quite know how to get to the alternative. But how do we grease the way so that the alternative is as attractive, or at least how do we make sure that the message of the military rule being the option, like how do we make sure people don't forget? I don't quite know the answer, but that's kind of something I'm thinking about because it's easy to say, how could these people possibly want to go back to military rule? But also people are tired and people want to continue living. Living during a war is life on pause, right? So people kind of want to unpause that and go back to something where there seems to be some sort of progress. Anyway, that was long-winded and it's yes,
very useful. No, it is very useful. I think people want a respite, right? So even if they know that if they get military rule again, it will lead to war and it will lead to fragmentation, it will lead to all these atrocities. They just want a temporary respite for now. So it's not about necessarily buying a different future. It is knowing with certainty that we're going exactly to where we were. But it's the idea that actually just anything that grants that temporary respite would be a plus. People want to leave, people want to find ways to make money, whatever it is, to be able to survive the next step, which is an impulse I totally understand. But, we have to get away, I think, from looking backwards for inspiration for what we want to make. We need to have the political courage to say, we will create the space to collectively form this future that we want, as unknown and potentially scary and filled with uncertainty as it is. And actually it's like the Make America Great Again slogan. This idea when we say, we want to go back to whatever it is, 1957, or, my parents' generation, the 60s and 70s, how it was all wonderful. Well, who was it wonderful for? Because it sure as hell wasn't wonderful for everyone, right? Same with the Make America Great Again slogan. So I think nostalgia is this very dangerous thing, as you said, yes, Al-Sara. It's very, it's full of erasure. It's full of, sort of compounded meanings. It's full of fictions. And we need to be very careful of that. We need to now, I think, recognize how far we came during those periods of revolution and push for that, looking forward into the future. And just briefly before we end, Nasreen, your question is, how do we make peace agreements and peace mediation processes better than they were before? How do we upend that sort of calculus of, I'll pick up a gun, I'll get invited to a mediation table, and then I'll get some kind of, output out of the process. I think that is the question for mediators right now, because it's very clear that mediation orthodoxies as they are just aren't fit for purpose. And certainly when you look at Sudan, previously, I would say previous to the revolution, there was this idea. I remember I was doing a sort of some research on, ownership of the comprehensive peace agreement. There was a peace agreement that ended the war between the North and the South in 2005. And I was asking, who owns this? Because to me, it seemed like the Bashir government in Khartoum and then some element of the SPLM leadership. That was it. And I said, who owns this beyond those people? And the answer was like, no, everybody owns this because those people represent everybody. And I was like, well, Bashir sure as hell doesn't represent me, so I have no stake in this game. And it's that understanding was very much, I think, part of just how things were done. I think after the revolution and this groundswell of popular engagement, etc., meant that you could no longer make that case, that you could just pick a handful of people, back to Sarah's point about picking elites, pick a handful of people and just assume they speak for everybody. They do not. And now not everybody, everybody may not want to come to the table, right? If I'm an IDP and I've been displaced and someone says to me, we invite you to the mediation table, I will be eaten alive by people who know exactly what they're doing at a mediation table. The Sudanese Armed Forces have had decades of experience in playing that game. So I may not want to come to the table, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't be able to dictate what is spoken at spoken about at that table. And then I may decide that I want to join at some point once the conditions are right. So it's all about breaking those mediation orthodoxies so that we don't focus on the who, but we focus on the what, what is being discussed, not who's at the table. And then we make sure that that table is wide enough to actually bring in a variety of different voices. That can be a complex process, but we need to start the work on that. It's not just applicable for Sudan, but many other places. And then we need to make sure that what is spoken about is actually the important stuff. I mean, people in this room who know the justice file far better than me will know that at every single turn, with every single political or peace process that we've had in Sudan, justice has always been deferred. It's this thing we'll think about. Don't worry, we'll think about it later on, down the line. And it's exactly the impunity that we get out of deferring injustice that leads us to where we are today. If the warring parties of different types did not think that they could get away with, wielding violence, they wouldn't do it. But they know that they can because, who has ever been through a justice process that has seen them be somehow impacted, their money, their pockets, their political positions. So it's about making sure we put the right things at the center, making sure we have the right agendas at the table. And then also if people want to come in, and it really does have to be a choice, that they have space at that table to come in. And that mediation orthodoxies, because mediation is almost always done externally, that the people who do that, whether they're in Western capitals or otherwise, really understand that things need to change in that sense. And really they need to be the ones to unpick that, as well as the people who want to be around that table. So it's a massive systemic change. And I'm not sure that there is any move to do that right now. If you look at all the processes Sudan is currently embroiled in, it's very much exactly the same as they were before. But I think what is different now is that you do have these people who are organized around Sudan and in the region around Sudan that have been recently displaced, who are able to articulate what they want and who are able to say, actually, we have a stake in this and we demand to be either us or our agenda to be at the table. So I think that's where we need to be headed. But unfortunately, we don't look to be heading that way. Thank you. Okay, I think we're over time. So I just want to say thank you to our panel and thank you all for listening. I know after lunch is usually the hardest session to pay attention to. But thank you for everyone.